It began with a discovery that should never have been possible. Two children slipping out of the world without a sound, unnoticed at first by anyone except the people who loved them, before their names filled headlines, before investigators unearthed the truth buried beneath layers of lies. There was just a simple, terrifying question. Where are Tylee and JJ? The question echoed long, before anyone realized it would become one of the most haunting mysteries in modern true crime. It started quietly, almost too quietly. Missed phone calls, unreturned messages, a mother whose explanations were coded in calm confidence while her children were nowhere to be seen. And yet, before the darkness swallowed them, these two children had been the beating heart of a family. Tylee Ryan, 16, was a kind of teenager who carried both fire and tenderness. She had her mother's smile, sharp wit, and a protective streak that made her JJ's shield from the world. Friends remember her laughter, quick, almost mischievous, as if she were always trying to brighten a room before anyone else realized it needed light. Joshua J.J. Vallow, just 7 years old, radiated a sweetness that softened everyone around him. Diagnosed with autism, he thrived within structure and the safety of routine. He adored his big sister, finding comfort in her steady presence, and loved to chatter excitedly about school, superheroes, and the simple joys children cling to. His grandparents called him a gift, a boy who made the world gentler just by being in it. These were children with futures stretching wide in front of them. Birthdays, friendships, dreams. But somewhere along the way, something sinister began to tighten around their lives. Quietly at first, unnoticed by those who believed they were safe, the shift began when their mother, Lori Vallow, started to transform. To those who knew her, Lori had always been charismatic, radiant, the kind of woman who walked into a room and commanded attention without trying. She was a devoted mother, a loving wife, a woman whose life seemed built on faith, family, and order. But cracks began to appear, small, unsettling fractures that widened over time. Lori became consumed by beliefs that blurred the edges of her reality. She spoke of visions, prophecies, spirits in darkness. And then she met Chad Daybell, a man whose own apocalyptic teachings fed those beliefs until they grew into something far more dangerous than anyone around them understood. To the outside world, they appeared calm, friendly, almost ordinary. But behind the closed doors of text messages, secret conversations, and late-night whispers grew a worldview where demons walked in borrowed bodies, and where some souls, they claimed, could be cast out. It was in this shifting, shadowed world that the lives of Tylee and JJ began to slip off course. Before anyone realized it, the warmth of a loving mother seemed replaced by something colder, distant, consumed by visions of an end-times battle only Lori and Chad seemed able to see. The children, once her highest priority, became obstacles within a narrative shaped by fear, prophecy, and obsession. And then, suddenly they were gone. No warnings, no goodbyes, just an unsettling silence where two children's voices once lived. Loved ones began to worry. Police started asking questions. But the answers were always the same: practiced, serene, dismissive. Lori insisted the children were safe, that everything was fine. And yet, each answer felt more hollow than the last. The world did not yet know what had happened to Tylee and JJ. But the truth, the real truth, had already begun its deadly descent. Their story, one of innocence lost and trust shattered, was now set on a collision course with the darkness growing inside their own home, a darkness no one could yet see clearly, and one that would soon horrify an entire nation. The silence surrounding Tylee and JJ deepened, but the world didn't yet understand the storm gathering behind it. As loved ones became increasingly uneasy, Lori Vallow's life was shifting rapidly, accelerating towards something dark and irreversible. What emerged next would reveal a pattern of chaos, death, and manipulation woven tightly around her and the man who would become her spiritual counterpart, Chad Guy Daybell. Before they ever appeared in the same headline, Chad lived what seemed to be a remarkably ordinary life. A quiet father, a devoted husband, a man rooted in his faith. He wrote novels filled with visions of apocalyptic futures, spiritual battles, and the thin veil between life and death. To many, he was harmless, eccentric, perhaps, but gentle. But those who later examined his writings and recorded beliefs found something more unsettling. Chad claimed to communicate with the beyond. He claimed access to knowledge about people's spiritual light or darkness. He described portals, past lives, and a coming cleansing of the earth. To some, these were harmless fantasies. To others, including Lori, they became gospel. When Lori met Chad, something in her life snapped into place, dangerously so. Their connection was instant, intense, and shrouded in secrecy. They exchanged emails and messages full of prophecies, missions, and a shared belief that they had been chosen for a divine purpose. Lori began labeling people around her, family, friends, even her own children, as light or dark, as though their worthiness could be measured on a scale only she and Chad understood, and those labeled dark. They were seen as obstacles. Around them, real lives began to crumble. Lori's marriage to Charles Vallow fell apart. Charles became terrified, not just concerned, for Lori's mental stability. He reached out to police, to family, to anyone who would listen. He warned them that Lori believed she was a godlike figure preparing for the end of the world. He pleaded for help, insisting that Lori's beliefs were spiraling into something dangerous. But his warnings went largely unheard. In July 2019, Charles Vallow was shot dead in Arizona by Lori's brother, Alex Cox. The story told the police was simple: self-defense. Case closed. No one looked further. Lori's reaction was disturbingly calm, almost cheerful. She joked with friends. She ordered pizza. She moved on as though the death of her husband was merely an inconvenience. Then, in September 2019, weeks before the children vanished, another tragedy struck. Tylee and JJ traveled with Lori, Alex, and several others to Yellowstone National Park. Pictures captured that day showed Tylee smiling, unaware it would be the final image ever taken of her. Shortly after, JJ was last seen alive, playing happily at home, oblivious of the darkness closing in. While all of this unfolded, another unexpected death shook the Daybell household. In October 2019, Tammy Daybell, Chad's wife of nearly 3 decades, was found dead in her bed. Chad insisted she had passed peacefully in her sleep. No autopsy was performed. Friends described Tammy as healthy, active, full of life. But within days of her death, Chad's behavior raised alarms. He remarried Lori just 2 weeks later in a beachside ceremony in Hawaii. 2 grieving spouses should have been consumed by heartbreak. Instead, their smiles were wide, their hands interlocked, their stories unbelievably thin. By now, the shadows around Lori and Chad were impossible to ignore. Loved ones of Tylee and JJ were desperate for answers. Police around the country began to piece together a trail of oddities: missing children, sudden deaths, bizarre beliefs, and 2 people who seemed to glide from tragedy to tragedy without shedding a single tear. And still, when investigators asked Lori where her children were, she answered with serenity, confidence, assurance. "They're safe," she said. "They're happy," she insisted. "They're exactly where they're supposed to be." But the fear in the hearts of those who loved Tylee and JJ only grew heavier, colder. The pieces weren't fitting. The excuses made no sense. And the timeline was tightening around something unthinkable. Somewhere in the quiet corners of Idaho, the truth was waiting, buried deep, waiting to be uncovered. Clues were beginning to surface. Suspicion was hardening into dread. And soon, investigators would discover that the silence surrounding the children wasn't just suspicious, it was deadly. The search for Tylee and JJ intensified as investigators pushed past Lori's calm deflections and Chad's hollow reassurances. Each day without answers felt heavier than the last. And by early 2020, the concern had shifted into something far more urgent. The children were not in Arizona. They were not in Idaho. They were not with friends or relatives. They were simply gone. Detectives retraced every step Lori had taken the months before the children disappeared. Storage unit footage revealed Lori casually visiting a rented unit with her brother, Alex Cox, depositing children's belongings, bicycles, school supplies, photographs, items a mother would never abandon unless she already knew her children would never need them again. Digital trails led investigators from Idaho to Arizona to Hawaii. People who had once been part of Lori's life came forward, describing her increasingly bizarre beliefs and the growing influence Chad had over her thinking. Their warnings were tinged with fear, with guilt, with the gnawing realization that something terrible might have already happened. Still, Lori insisted the children were safe. Still, Chad maintained they were fine. But the evidence whispered a different truth. Then came the breakthrough, one that shifted the investigation irrevocably. A search warrant was executed on Chad Daybell's rural Idaho property. The land was peaceful, green, and quiet, an unassuming stretch of earth hiding secrets too dark to be imagined. Investigators combed to the grounds with precision, guided by data, interviews, and a growing sense of dread. They focused on an area near a fire pit behind the Daybell home, an area that had been disturbingly active during the weeks the children vanished. As shovels broke the soil, something beneath the surface stopped the teen cold. What they found was not just evidence. It was horror. The remains of J.J. Vallow were uncovered first, tightly bound, hidden, treated not with the dignity owed to a child, but with the cold attachment of someone determined to erase him from the world. He had been buried as though his life meant nothing. The reality of his final moments, small, vulnerable, terrified, broke even the most seasoned investigators. Nearby, in a separate site shielded by debris and shallow earth, they found what was left of Tylee Ryan. Her remains told a story of violence so devastating that prosecutors would later describe her treatment as brutal and extreme. She had been dismembered and burned, her identity nearly erased. It was an act not of impulse, but of deliberate cruelty, carried out with the intention to destroy every trace of who she had been. The earth had held the truth silently for months. Now it screamed. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. Officers on the scene wept. Communities across the country shook with disbelief. Social media erupted with heartbreak, anger, and an overwhelming sense of grief for children who had suffered unimaginable fate. And as the grim recovery unfolded, Chad Daybell stood by, watching. According to witnesses, he appeared nervous, then resigned, as though the collapse of his carefully built illusions was finally catching up to him. He was arrested on the spot. Lori, sitting in a Hawaii jail cell on charges related to child endangerment, was informed of the discovery soon after. Those who saw her that day noted a chilling detail. There were no tears, no visible signs of despair, no outward acknowledgement of the nightmare that had just been uncovered. In the months that followed, detectives pieced together the events leading up to the children's deaths. Digital messages revealed chilling discussions of zombies, souls being taken over, and children being labeled as dark. For prosecutors, these were not just bizarre beliefs, they were motive, they were justification. They were the twisted framework used to rationalize the unthinkable. The crime scene on Chad's property was more than evidence. It was a window into the darkness that had consumed Lori and Chad. Their fantasies of apocalypse, reincarnation, and spiritual cleansing had crossed over into real life with devastating consequences. What had begun as a missing person search had become something far more harrowing. The children were no longer missing. They had been found. But the truth of what had happened to them, why it had happened, was only beginning to surface. The tragedy now demanded answers. And the courtroom would become the place where those answers finally emerged. The discovery of Tylee and JJ shattered any illusion Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell had tried to maintain. What followed was a wave of indictments, charges, and revelations that dragged every hidden secret into the light. The story that prosecutors laid out was more disturbing than anyone outside the case had imagined. A convergence of fanaticism, manipulation, and cold-blooded calculation. As Lori was extradited back to Idaho to face charges, the world waited for answers. Her once radiant smile had hardened into something unreadable, as though the woman she had once been was gone, replaced by someone capable of believing the deaths of her own children were part of a divine plan. Court documents painted a timeline that was chilling in its clarity. Lori and Chad had embraced a belief system that divided people into light and dark, determining who was spiritually alive and who had supposedly become a zombie. Prosecutors argued that these labels were not harmless expressions of faith. They were tools, steps in a mental process that allowed Lori and Chad to justify eliminating anyone they saw as an obstacle to their union or their apocalyptic vision. The jury listened as investigators described the months leading up to the killings. They heard about the secret messages between Lori and Chad, discussing spiritual rankings, death percentages, and the children's supposed possession by dark entities. These were not fleeting thoughts. They were methodical, repeated, intentional, and then came the physical evidence. Item by item, the prosecution laid out what had been found on Chad's property: shallow graves, burn patterns, tools used to conceal the remains, and the heartbreaking details of how the children's bodies were treated. Detectives who had worked the scene testified through tears. For the jury, it was impossible not to feel the weight of what had been done. Family members took the stand, their voices shaking as they described how their concerns had grown in the final weeks of the children's lives. Tylee's friends remember her fading presence, her final cheerful photo in Yellowstone forever burned into the national memory. JJ's grandparents spoke through breaks of grief about the little boy they'd adored, the calls that stopped coming, the birthday he never reached, the fear they had felt long before anyone listened. As Lori sat in court, her expression remained unchanged. She showed no visible emotion as the prosecutors described Tylee's final moments or JJ's suffering. The contrast was jarring. Witnesses openly wept while Lori's gaze remained steady, distant, almost defiant. Prosecutors argued that Lori had not simply been manipulated by Chad. They painted her as an active architect of the plan, someone who believed she was chosen for a higher mission, one that required her children to be removed. The court heard recordings of Lori calmly discussing spiritual battles, dismissing concerns about her missing children, and focusing instead on her future with Chad. The defense tried to argue that Lori was a victim of Chad's influence, guided by his apocalyptic teachings, and convinced she was following divine instructions. But the evidence of her involvement, her messages, her actions, her decisions, left little room for doubt. After weeks of testimony, the jury retreated to deliberate. They returned with a verdict that echoed across the nation: guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of conspiracy, guilty of the destruction of evidence. The courtroom shook with quiet sobs, but still Lori remained calm. When sentencing day arrived, the world watched closely. The judge spoke with visible anger and sorrow, describing Lori's actions as a betrayal of the most sacred role a mother could ever hold. He condemned her choices, her lack of remorse, and the suffering inflicted on two innocent children who had trusted her completely. Lori Vallow Daybell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a punishment symbolic of the lives she extinguished and the devastation she left behind. But the story didn't end there. As Lori settled into a prison cell, Chad Daybell prepared to face his own reckoning. His trial revealed even more chilling details. Further messages, deeper roots of the belief system he shared with Lori, a trail of manipulation that stretched back years. And in 2024, a jury found him guilty of murder as well. He would receive the ultimate sentence: death. The trials exposed a dark partnership built on shared delusions and fueled by an obsession that devoured everything in its path. But even with the verdicts delivered, questions lingered. Questions about how this could have happened, why no one intervened sooner, and what signs had gone unnoticed until it was too late. The truth was now undeniable, yet the emotional fallout had only just begun. Even after the verdict in Idaho brought a measure of justice for Tylee and JJ, the legal reckoning surrounding Lori Vallow Daybell was not over. The trials had revealed the horror of what happened, but they also exposed deeper patterns. Other deaths, other attempts, and decisions that rippled the lives of countless people long before the children's disappearance. And the law demanded answers for those. 2. Authorities in Arizona had long suspected that the events surrounding the death of Charles Vallow, Lori's previous husband, were not the self-defense scenario originally presented. Charles had feared for his life, reaching out to police, friends, and family. He warned them that Lori believed he was a dark spirit and that she had become obsessed with Chad's teachings. He knew something was coming. He said it plainly. He tried to protect his children, but no one intervened in time. Months after her Idaho conviction, Lori was extradited to Arizona to face new charges. In the quiet confines of the courtroom, prosecutors laid out a disturbing picture. Not an isolated tragedy, but a pattern of orchestrated violence. They argued that Lori had conspired in the killing of Charles Vallow, using the very same belief system she later used to justify the deaths of Tylee and JJ. Evidence showed she had told close confidants that Charles was possessed, that his death was necessary, and that she and Chad would soon be free to begin their prophesied mission. The jury listened as investigators replayed Lori's own words, her laughter on recordings, her chilling lack of urgency after the shooting. They heard how she immediately threw herself into fantasies of a new life with Chad, even as Charles's body lay in the next room. The verdict was unmistakable. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, but there was still more. Another Arizona case, an attempted killing that many believed was a warning blow before the tragedy spiraled out of control, was finally brought into the open. Lori was also convicted for conspiring in the attempted murder of Brandon Boudreaux, her niece Melani's former husband. Brandon had survived a drive-by shooting in 2019, a bullet grazing him after a masked gunman opened fire. Evidence tied the attempt to the same circle of people surrounding Lori at the time, the same apocalyptic logic, the same willingness to categorize someone as dark and therefore disposable. With both Arizona convictions secured, the judge handed down sentences that mirrored the gravity of the crimes. Life in prison, again and again, ensuring Lori would never walk free. Across the country, the reaction to these new convictions was a mix of relief and heartbreak. For some, it was vindication, proof that the warnings they had voiced for years had finally been heard. For others, it was salt in a wound that would never fully heal. Communities in both Idaho and Arizona reeled from the revelations. Friends who once trusted Lori felt haunted by memories of her smile, now twisted into something sinister. Families who had loved her struggled to reconcile the woman they knew what the woman in the court proved she had become. The deaths of Tylee, JJ, and Charles shattered more than just lives. They shattered the sense of safety and intuition among those who once believed evil always looked like a monster, never like a mother, a friend, a neighbor. And still, questions linger. Questions that no courtroom could ever fully answer. How did Lori fall so deeply into the world Chad created? Where did her delusion end and her intent begin? Could anyone have stopped the chain of events before it consumed 3 innocent lives? Why did warnings go unheeded for so long? And perhaps the most painful question of all, was there ever a moment, even a small one, when any of this could have been undone? The tragedy of Tylee and JJ reverberates because it exposes a truth people fear to acknowledge. That danger can wear a warm smile, that manipulation can grow quietly, that a belief system taken too far can become a weapon sharper than any blade. As the prisons close behind Lori and Chad forever, the story remains etched into the minds of all who followed it, not simply as a case of crime and punishment, but as a chilling reminder of how fragile trust can be, how blind love can turn deadly, and how children, bright, innocent, hopeful, are too often the ones who pay the cost of adult delusions. Their voices are gone, but their story remains. A warning, a tragedy, a plea for vigilance when reality begins to crack around someone you love. If this case left you with questions, theories, or reflections, share them. Stories like this linger, not just because of the horror, but because of the human need to understand how such darkness grows in ordinary lives. And if you want more stories told with this depth, this honesty, and this emotional weight, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications on. More true crime stories await. Stories that deserve to be heard, remembered, and learned from.